Hey guys, MrPokke here, back with another video, and today we'll be discussing in depth with regards to Ruan Mei's team compositions for both Duo DPS as well as Hypercarry. Ruan Mei is quite literally a meta-defining support, like I've mentioned in my Ruan Mei CNN analysis, bringing both archetypes of team comps into even greater heights. We will be discussing some of her most optimal teams and see which teams does she bring the highest damage increase. For our sustain unit, Huo is the de facto best in slot for damage output. So we will be taking a little bit of a bigger focus onto what kind of DPS should we be using her with, as well as what kind of other supports does she make use of, right? So as always, viable is not the same as optimal. And without further ado, let's just jump straight into today's content. Subscribe! Treat me like white teeth. Don't get me dirty. So two things that players should take into consideration, one of which is being the buff compositions for Ruan Mei. Now Ruan Mei has a very high amount of damage percentage buffs, leading to most, if not all DPS units benefiting from using an attack percentage sphere instead of a elemental damage sphere. In the case of Blade, that's going to be HP instead of attack. Res penetration is also a universal buff that has not faced a lot of competition from others, whereas Break Effect is a minor upgrade to our total damage, while Break Efficiency improves our overall combat experience, as such as, for example, when True Swarm is going to let go of his ultimate, we can now break it before True Swarm can let go of his ultimate. Then there's a lot of value to be gained over there, right? Secondly, we will be taking a look at Ruan Mei's DPS benchmark. So Ruan Mei, she greatly improves pretty much every single DPS damage output, but the question is, how much more does she increase for each DPS? Because at the end of the day, we can only use one Ruan Mei for both of our teams, so it would be in the player's best interest to use Ruan Mei with a DPS that can see the highest damage increase, or rather a team composition that can see the highest damage increase. So with that being established, ironic as it may be, Hypercarry team comps still outperform Duo DPS team comps in the current MOC format. Pretty much every single one of the MOC 12 testings that I've taken a look from Bilibili, from YouTube, as well from my own countless hours of experimentations, Hypercarry team comps, they still generally tend to do a lot more damage within the same motion values as compared to a Duo DPS. This is not to say that Duo DPS is completely unviable, because you can definitely use Duo DPS to clear content, but when it comes to players that just want to deal the highest amount of damage possible, then the Hypercarry will still outperform Duo DPS, and I will get to this a little bit more later, right? So let's just jump straight into the Duo DPS setup. For all Duo DPS team comps, Ruan Mei is the exclusive top tier support with very little competition from Asta or Pella. But that being said, like I mentioned just now, Hypercarry setups are still the better comp in terms of the highest damage output. But when Duo DPS can eventually overthrow Hypercarry team comps in the future, who knows, we can get a new unit, new DPS, or even new content, right? So when that day eventually happens, then Ruan Mei will definitely be part of the set team comp, because she just far outperforms all of our other supports we have right now. So this is inherently not a Ruan Mei issue, but it is just Duo DPS being a little bit more problematic, right? Due to two main reasons. Number one, we basically need both of our DPS to be in the right elemental coverage. So if your Duo DPS is, for example, Blade and Jingliu, the enemy needs to be weak to both ice and wind in order to see the full benefit. Secondly, also the combined damage from 2 DPS plus 1 support, even though the support is Ruan Mei, it is still generally lower than 2 support with 1 Hypercarry, and in particular one of the support being Bronya, because Bronya is just that great of a damage amplifier, right? So that is basically the gist of the whole Duo DPS setup. And now going into some of the damage calculations, as you can see here, for the follow-up damage team comp, currently our only Duo DPS archetype other than DOT is realistically Topaz plus another follow-up attacker. this could be Jingliu, and this could be Clara, or in the future, Dr. Ratio, right? And to no one's surprise, Ruan Mei outperforms Bronya due to her multi-targeted buffs, right? Both our DPS can benefit from the all-type rest penetration, damage percentage, as well as the weakness break efficiency, as compared to Bronya, which most of the time is only from her skill before she can cast her ultimate. And another thing to note is units like Jingyuan's Lightning Lord, they can benefit from Ruan Mei's skill, unlike Bronya's skill, right? That's why you can see that for this duo DPS with Topaz plus Ruan Mei plus Jingyuan, this will see the highest damage increase, right? A whopping 12% higher damage as compared to Bronya, Topaz, and Jingyuan. The reason why Clara is on the lower spectrum is essentially due to anti-synergy, right? The more we break a unit, then the less counters we will get from the enemies, which in turn results to Clara dealing less damage overall. That's why Clara tend to be not in a very good spot as compared to Topaz and Jingyuan, right? We may see more dual DPS archetypes in the future, but for now, this is the only benchmark available, right? For Blade and Jingliu, I'll be talking about them a little bit later on under Jingliu's section. And then another dual DPS team comp is definitely going to be our DOT units. And to no one's surprise, Kafka, or essentially any DOT comp, they gain the highest benefit with Ruan Mei, a whopping 16% final damage increase as compared to R-Star previously, right? Because damage percentage, rest penetration, break effect, they all benefit DOT units. Break efficiency, they also essentially front load our DOT burst since we now weakness break the enemy target faster, right? The extended broken state, now some players may think this might be a pretty bad thing because if we don't break more frequently, that means we have less break damage, right? But ironically, that's not the case because when during Ruan Mei's weakness broken state, it acts essentially the same as an ice weakness break, which means we advance the enemy's turn even faster, which further front loads our DOT damage. So that's why Ruan Mei is one of, if not the best DOT supports we have right now, and most possibly for a very long time to come. And then particularly, I just want to take a little bit of a deep dive over here. You can see that Bronya definitely doesn't perform very well with DOT team comp because there is Sampo and Kafka. That's why Bronya performs even worse than, like, let's say R-Star, right? And then between Sampo and Luca, Sampo there's a slight overperformance due to DOT vulnerability, right? But the most important thing between Sampo and Luca is that you should be using the secondary DOT as the right element. So against physical weak enemies, you'll definitely want to run Luca, and against wind weak enemies, you'll definitely want to run Sampo. I'm not really sure exactly why the graphs didn't show Kuei and Iphone, but I'm assuming that's going to be the very similar results anyways, right? So that is that for DOT. Then moving on to the Hypercarry setup. Now, the Hypercarry setup for Ruan Mei, the buffs are being very overweighted on damage percentage, which is why she slightly falls short as compared to other supports. Now, although she does have rest penetration, she does have weakness break efficiency, but there are way more important mechanics to a Hypercarry team comp, namely extra turn mechanic, energy battery from Ting Yun, as well as weakness implant from Seele, and they often give us a lot more value for a Hypercarry team comp. However, she is an extremely strong second support, making her a very flexible unit since players will ultimately need two supports for Hypercarry, right? So as you can see from this CN chart over here, for the Hypercarry setup, essentially you pretty much have to bring one of these three units, right? Either Bronya, Ting Yun, or Seele. But for our secondary support, then players can feel free to pick Ruan Mei. And in fact, Ruan Mei is just really well once we have ensured one of the three units above, ideally Bronya, right? So that is that for Hypercarry explanation. And then just moving on to some numbers below for Jingliu specifically, as the strongest unit in our game, especially at E0S1, Jingliu just got even stronger with the addition of Ruan Mei, outperforming the old Pelacom by a whole 6%. This is mainly due to Jingliu's extremely high attack percentage from her own talent, which balances out Ruan Mei's excess damage percentage buffs, right? Because as we know, we want to balance out the number of attack percentage and damage percentage buffs we can get for our main DPS. The duo DPS setup with Blade is honestly a pretty competitive choice, which is only 9% lesser than a Hypercarry setup. But this is still much better than the old Blade plus Bronya, right? In the old Blade plus Bronya, it is a very low at only 81.26% as compared to our highest potential damage right now. So fundamentally, Jingliu Hypercarry, it is still the strongest E0 Hypercarry we have in Honkai starrail. She's very easy to gear, she's very easy to use, and she has a very high damage ceiling because we can essentially just throw all of our subsets into crit damage, right? And Ruan Mei simply took Jingliu to the next level, especially with Bronya. For Jingliu comms, Bronya just works super well. You can see that for pretty much every single one of this team comms, the top 5 teams, out of the 5 teams, 4 of them includes Bronya, and the only team that really outperform is Ruan Mei plus Blade, right? So that is that for Jingliu. And another example for another hypercarry you can see here, that's going to be Argenti. Now Argenti, we actually see Tingyun and Bronya slightly outperforming Ruan Mei and Bronya by roughly 3.5%. Now this is mainly due to Tingyun providing a better enhanced ultimate uptime for Argenti, which is absolutely critical for his damage output. Hanya is also a very close substitute to Ruan Mei at only a 1% difference, right? 95.44 versus 96.53. Now talking about Seele or Zila's benefits with Ruan Mei, frankly speaking, her benefit as a hypercarry, it is also not as strong as compared to a lot of our other hypercarry units, particularly for 2 main reasons. Number 1, Seele herself has a lot of damage percentage buff, to the point where if you players do not run an attack percentage sphere, then the benefits you will get from Ruan Mei is definitely going to be much lesser compared to a lot of our other supports such as Tingyun or Pella or even Silver Wolf. And another reason is quite frankly not because of Ruan Mei, but because in patch 2.0 we are gonna be getting Hanabi or Sparkle, right? And when that actually happens, it is very likely theorized that the Mono Quantum Dream with Fu Xuan, Sparkle, Silver Wolf, and Zila is gonna be one of the most universal compositions that players can use. So strictly because of this future prospect that players might be able to get themselves into, they are better off running Ruan Mei with another team comp instead, right? Not to say it is not that viable, but it's just that Ruan Mei has better uses somewhere else. Seele also functions really well from higher energy costs from either Bronya's extra turn, which allows her to use more skills, or from Tingyun's energy buff. Because if Zila is able to use her ultimate with a very high multiplier and kill a target, for example a lead with low health, she can then instantly proc Resurgence, and that is something that Ruan Mei is unable to provide because she is more like a stationary support that allows our DPS to just keep going consistently instead of giving some additional out of turn values like Bronya's extra turn or Tingyun's extra energy. So we can see that with these 2 examples, the gap between supports in a hypercarry scenario, it is much smaller as compared to a duo DPS setup, right? So what this essentially tells the players is you have very little choice if you want to run a duo DPS if you do not have Ruan Mei, because all the other supports, they frankly speaking, they perform a lot worse than Ruan Mei. But for players that want to run a hypercarry comp, you can see that even without Ruan Mei, the performance is not super bad, as long as we still have those key supports we have from the past, right? Bronya, Tingyun, Hanya, Yukon, all that kind of stuff. So that is essentially the gist of Ruan Mei standing in a hypercarry setup. Then one more bonus team, that is gonna be the break team. Now this is a little bit difficult to quantify, especially with the delayed action value, break damage, and exactly how much do we value a team that can essentially keep the enemy in a broken state. Would we even need to run a sustain unit? So this kind of things is a little bit hard to quantify, but it is entirely possible to run a break team without a sustain, and we just defeat the content before taking too much damage, right? So the 2 main things that players need to keep note of for a break team is, of course, weakness implant from Silver Wolf to ensure flexibility, so you can run Ruan Mei with pretty much most of these breakers, right? And secondly, high break efficiency units like Welt, Asta, Sampo, Luca, and Xueyi. They either have bounce attacks, or they have extra turns, or they just deal a lot of toughness bar from their AoE attacks. So if players do want to build a break team and try it themselves, it is highly recommended to build Ruan Mei with a very high break effect, even higher than 180%, using this comp to maximize the additional break damage that we can gain from Ruan Mei. In summary, Ruan Mei is no doubt an extremely powerful support, and due to the limitation of one unit, players should allocate which teams to give their Ruan Mei in order to see the highest damage increase for both teams, right? Not just one team, which would then help the player get a much more comfortable endgame content clear. As you guys know by now, the current Memory of Chaos 12 as well as the Gold and Glitter, it is definitely not a walk in the park as compared to the previous Memory of Chaos 10, right? So having the right setup is definitely going to help players a lot. So 2 potential setup for duo DPS and DOT is going to be Ruan Mei plus a secondary DPS. This is very straightforward. And then for Hypercarry team comp, most of the time we do want to run Bronya just because of how good she is with Ruan Mei or Tingyun or others. Experiment with yourself because theory can only go so far. At this point, players are probably asking, will there ever be a situation where Ruan Mei actually outperforms Bronya in a hypercarry setup? Meaning to say, we straight up choose Ruan Mei over Bronya with the addition of other supports. This kind of scenarios, I wouldn't say it's impossible, but it is very, very dependent on the DPS. So some units that may come to a player's mind when actually playing after trying them out themselves, for example, is gonna be Imbibiru. Basically, units that have a very, very high skill point consumption, they might not be able to utilize Bronya very, very well, and this can be seen from even back in before Ruan Mei was released, right? Units that tend to not synergize very well with Bronya, they could potentially see a high damage increase with the addition of Ruan Mei in this specific scenarios. So as you can see from my previous MOC's Trial 0 cycles, I can say for a fact that if I were to slot in Bronya to my team comps, I would definitely not have enough skill points unless I have a ridiculously fast support or we run additional passerby pieces to provide the extra skill points that Imbibiru requires, right? So these are one of the scenarios where I can actually think where Ruan Mei outperforms Bronya in this hypercarry scenario. But generally, from all of the consensus I've seen from all of the CN community, it seems that Bronya still stands as the undisputed hypercarry support for pretty much almost every single hypercarry comps. Taking a look at Jingliu, taking a look at Blade, taking a look at Seele, all these comps, they still essentially have a very, very big damage increase from Bronya, but after the addition of Ruan Mei, their damage just goes up to become even higher without replacing Bronya. So there is the general consensus as to does Ruan Mei outperform Bronya? In CN's opinion, there is basically no need to even compare the two because number one, we have two teams required in Honkai starrail. There is never a situation where if you have both Bronya and Ruan Mei, you couldn't run Bronya and Ruan Mei on the different teams in Memory of Chaos. So that's number one, right? And number two, they are essentially competing in a completely different event in a track and field, right? One person is competing in running, the other person is competing in javelin toss, right? There's the first place for both events doesn't necessarily mean that they are better than one another. And with that, we have come to the end of Ruan Mei's team analysis. If you guys want to engage in further discussions, feel free to leave a comment down below or hop on over to Pokke's village. We have a very active community talking about honkaistarrail on a daily basis. If you guys want to check out my stream, that's going to be at twitch.tv/MrPokke, where I'm streaming 2 to 3 times a week, and the schedule will be updated on Discord as well. Alright, so that's all I have for today. All the best for your Ruan Mei pools, and I'll see you guys next time. Happy New Year, and take care. I genuinely cannot believe this shit. I genuinely cannot believe this shit. I genuinely cannot believe this shit, guys. Did I say how I genuinely cannot believe this shit? I genuinely cannot believe this shit, guys.